Evening, everyone. Welcome to TEL 711's weekly discussion. I'm Kelly, and I have Kimara and Sandra here with me. And we are going to be discussing Perry's dissertation from 2010, writing about the change process. So we want to discuss two key concepts from Rogers' Diffusion of an Innovation Model. And we'll be describing how we might be able to capitalize on these concepts in our own innovation or intervention work, and really just kind of talking about the diffusion of an innovation model from this dissertation that we read. So I'll get us started, and the first thing that I kind of pulled out of this reading, first of all, it seemed lengthy, and there was a lot of concepts, and I was just talking earlier to the group about how just kind of pulling out two concepts almost seemed a little bit difficult, but I really appreciated how they talked about the channel of communication as the change process when they were outlining the definitions of the roles of who the innovator is, what the innovation is, who the adopter is, and then that change process being that channel of communication in the middle. I did kind of think about this in the context of my own problem of practice, where I'm designing effective professional development for middle and high school educators for technology integration. The model I'm actually looking at is TPAC, which really has to do with like technology integration. However, professional development, like it's all about communication. Like it has to do with the way it's delivered, whether it's going to be in an asynchronous format, whether it's synchronous, whether it's face-to-face, that entire program itself is all communications. And some of the more interesting ones that I feel like will really enact the change and be part of that change process are like professional learning communities, and like having these educators communicate through just different and interesting channels. One that I've mentioned before, maybe I may not have even mentioned in this group, but it's called Discord. It's really a social platform for video gamers, but it's something that I've want to experiment with educators. So educators are on Twitter, and that, maybe 10 years ago seemed really innovative and sort of crazy, but now I'm looking at some of these things, and I think that just the whole diffusion of an innovation kind of plays into this in that sort of context. The other concept, which is not necessarily talked about in this dissertation, but it was something that I was just asking the group about as well, was relating it to, I come from a tech background, so I'm always thinking about technology, and I remember reading about the innovators, the people who are basically kind of inventing the new stuff that's coming out, and then the early adopters, and then the laggards, the ones that are either never going to do it or are very far behind. My field of work, what I do in education, I've talked about this before, when I'm reading literature about technology integration, they're often talking about computers and iPads, and that's where they are, where I'm building things around XR. I'm creating virtual reality experiences for students and immersive things, and I'm working with artificial intelligence and machine learning. And so the technology I'm working with that I'm trying to get adopted is already in this really realm of very early adoption in terms of what I'm looking at. So I want to dig a little more into the diffusion of innovation. I didn't get all the way through it to the end because it felt kind of like a conceptual overview, but I'm kind of at the point now, my next question is so how do you do it? How does it actually work at the end? I think that's where I am. So
I'll jump in here, and if that's okay with you, Kamara. So I had come across the diffusion, this book, the Diffusion of Innovation book. I don't know, I think it was well over 15 years ago when we were doing a lot of innovation work for Big Brothers Big Sisters of America, and it was one of my teammates that really was into this study of innovation, and he was the one that told me about, we've got to get this group of people first. So it was this whole thinking about this is all without having read any of the stuff that we read from Cotter or from Rogers, but thinking about we've got to find the first adopters, which we would call like the early adopters, and we've got to get them to help us build these communication channels. So in hindsight, looking back, I have been able to experience what it is to work the bell curve, right? And to talk about who the innovators are and who the early adopters are, and how you set yourself up for success by just focusing on them. And then they end up telling you more and informing more the process of how it goes to get to the early majority and the late majority. So I thought it was really cool to read that here again. The 5 characteristics of an innovation is probably where I felt, where I paused and thought more about the innovation that I'm working on, which this week is, it's the same one as it was 2 weeks ago. It went back. So this contextualized first year seminar course for students. So the relative advantage concept, right, which is the extent to which an innovation is perceived as being better than what it's replacing. SLS 1106 is this course. And I have interviewed informally for the class assignment, like tons and tons and tons of people that had taught it in the past, because now it's mostly taught by adjuncts. So there are very few, if any, full-time faculty that are teaching it anymore. And so I get the sense that it's going to be a welcomed innovation that someone would want to test simply because they have expressed a need for its revamping. Let's just put it that way. So this idea that, all right, that's got to be better than this, especially if I'm speaking to faculty that are that have an affinity towards changemaker education. They have a sense of what it means. They have an understanding of what that's like. So that goes to the second characteristic, which is the compatibility characteristic of an innovation. And that speaks to the congruence of the innovation and the actual values and experience and perceived needs of those adopters. And so I feel like I'm hopeful in a way that the concept of the innovation that I have on the table is going to be accepted by those that are full-time faculty. The challenge for me is that I don't know the part-time adjuncts that are teaching. In fact, it's a whole nother issue at the college. Even though I'm getting ahead of myself, it has nothing to do. This is where I tend to trip up. Like, I'm already thinking about the scaling of something when we haven't even determined that it works. But this idea that if this were an innovation that was viable, you know, how would I work those communication channels to sort of have alignment, this compatibility construct? Because adjunct faculty, you know, they can just take that syllabus and do whatever they want to do. They don't have to teach it this way. So I have been thinking about what would be the incentive, what would be the reasons, how might I align it with, this is going to, I think it says here in the relative advantage section, it ties to the values of the adopter. So if you want to have more fun teaching the course, if you want to bring in your personal connection to change making and find more purpose, which I still believe people that get into education do it because they want to do it, not because they have to do it. Yeah. That there'll be some uptick in this, but I don't know. Those are some of the things that I was thinking about while I was reading this chapter.
Thanks, Sandra. I actually have a line in my KMBC log that says, I realize that I'm not supposed to be talking about this yet because this is way beyond the scope of our POP, but I'm already trying to figure out how do I get this adopted right throughout
so I'm not crazy.
No, I completely relate to that. I actually think that's the practitioner in us, right? That says, but how are we actually getting this? Yeah, I really resonate with what both you and Kelly said. I think for me, maybe I'll just pick out a couple of areas that are different. So it was earlier in the dissertation portion on Rogers where Perry was suggesting that change agents should be aware of native knowledge that already exists within the organization and not assume that you're going in sort of de novo or like they have no and for me, that just really jumped out, right? Like, what do the folks in academic medicine already think about flourishing? What do they think about the role of the system and burnout and the mental models that are holding these things in place? And, how can I utilize the cycles of research to really make sure that I'm honoring that and then like using that in my methodology and how I'm going to move forward instead of sort of assuming like, oh, I'm bringing this great new idea of flourishing and everyone's going to think it's great, right? I already know, because this is also my day job, I already know that that's not going to be the case, but
Right.
I thought that was just really good to
Yeah.
remind me, like, okay, they're all coming with preconceived ideas, experiences, life. How does that play into sort of the adoption and then ultimately the diffusion of the innovation? And then the second thing was this idea of complexity, which is that the more complex the innovation is to understand, the less likely long-term adoption, which makes complete sense.
Right.
But then he goes on with this concept of complexity later on to say that the actual adoption can be hindered by the complexity of the system, right? So in terms of barriers to this diffusion, and I may have said this already, but like people have studied the animal that is academic medicine and said that it is probably the most complex organization that exists. And so it really does, when I think about my pop and then ultimately what we're looking to do, I've always said, like, for me, this is like long-term, this is long game. And that is where I think for my pop, trying to keep it small and not feel like it's going to be inconsequential, because I think there's this piece of me that's like, okay, so I'm going to do this, and it's just going to be like, woo, she did that with one group of people. What's going to come of it? So I think it's trying to keep all of these concepts in mind and then use that to inform, what we learn through this process, and then post successful completion of this program and successful defense. What does this mean moving forward? And that's where I think Rogers' work really continues to be, hopefully really impactful in terms of how we keep it going.
I think that I can really appreciate your long game comment, right? Because that's kind of the conversation that I had last week with this additional person that I was telling you guys. I was reaching out to different people in my network, and she said, I'm going to post this on my forehead or probably on the wall, small but elegant, And I was like, say that again. And it's exactly what you said. Like, to us, we want to boil the ocean. I think about Mertler when he said, like, you will not solve for world hunger. And I wasn't trying to either, but sometimes in my head, I just feel like, but it's gotta be so awesome and so meaningful that it's going to make. And then she reminded me, once you get your doctorate and you have this clean and small but elegant piece of work, then you can go about the long game. And that was really helpful for me, because it took off not the pressure in terms of like, it's got to be done well, but I was probably, to your point about the complexity of the system within which we're trying to affect change. That is what scares people off the table. So I'm like, here I am thinking about scaling something when I don't even know if it works. So part of my pop is to explore and unpack. And that is in and of itself contribution to the field. I mean, right? So I really with that idea of just sort of.
I struggle with scale too. And it has to do with the system that I work within. So you hear me talk about grant funding, and I think that's where, so I work with, on the one hand, the middle schools, there are hundreds of middle schools across the United States. So now we're like scale up times 2, it's several hundreds of educators and then thousands of students. So like that's on my weight, but I have this opportunity because I'm working on a pilot that is small. And it is just a couple schools. And I kept like wondering, like, where do I go? Which way do I go? Of course, my brain, that was part of the last conversation where I was talking about where I was on that phone call, like, and I didn't want to like let myself go off, because I'm like, nope, this is a scaling, like, think about scaling, Kelly. Like, you're not going to get to sit here and like interview every single person, and get all this information every single time. But I need to do it now in the beginning. Like, this is where that trial, but my brain is always at thinking of scale too. And everything you both said about the complexity, completely, relate to that. Interestingly enough, talking about the, like, what do you know, and determining what a system and institution or what people already know. I do instructional design. That's sort of like my specialty to go into professional development. And in instructional design, the very first thing you do is a needs analysis. And in that needs analysis, that's what you ask. You figure out what you already know. Because you don't want to teach something to someone that they already know, or if they know it and they know it a certain way, you know, and your outcome, you know, we also talked about defining like, what is your outcome? What do you want?
Mhm.
You know, how do you get there if you know you're working with this?
Yeah.
And if you didn't ask, then you're never going to know. So great conversation. Well, we are just about at our time. So
Okay.
thank you so much, everyone. And hope you all have a wonderful evening. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.